Bruce, you've been in a few bands, few groups over the years. You know a little bit about them. You know, rock groups and pop groups are just the tip of the iceberg. There are millions and millions of different groups out there. You've got family for a start, you've got friends, you've got fraternities, you've got political groups, you've got religious denominations, all kinds of groups, millions and millions and millions of them. And I suppose, in a sense, you know, society wouldn't be able to function if we didn't have groups. They're kind of the social vectors that carry us as individuals through our lives. And we are joined today by a guy that knows more about groups than most. It's Professor Dominic Abrams. He's Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. He's the Director of the Centre of the Study of Group Processes down there. He's basically the world group champion. And he also had the distinct misfortune of teaching me many moons ago. So he's nodding there rather painfully.
Well, you know how they say you can't teach your grandmother to suck eggs.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Couldn't teach you a bloody thing.
The thing is, Kevin, how being taught by Dominic, it's aged you.
If only you knew, Bruce. If only you knew. There's another podcast just on my student years. Dominic, great to have you on. Really lovely to see you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. It's great to be here, Kevin.
Now, I've dug up my favourite group joke for you. Okay, so I thought we'd start with it. I'm going to read it out. Okay. I was walking across a bridge one day when I saw a man standing on the edge about to jump off. So I run over and I shout, "Stop, don't do it." "Why shouldn't I?" he says. I said, "Well, there's so much to live for." He said, "Like what?" I said, "Well, are you religious or atheist?" He said, "Religious." I said, "Me too. Are you Christian or Buddhist?" He said, "Christian." I said, "Me too. Are you Catholic or Protestant?" He said, "Protestant." I said, "Me too. Are you Methodist or Baptist?" He said, "Baptist." I said, "Wow, me too. Are you Baptist Church of God or Baptist Church of the Lord?" He said, "Baptist Church of God." I said, "Me too. Are you Original Baptist Church of God or Reformed Baptist Church of God?" He said, "Reformed Baptist Church of God." I said, "Me too. Are you Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation of 1879 or Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation of 1915? He said, "I am Reformed Baptist Church of God Reformation of 1915. So I said, "Die, heretic scum," and pushed him off. Took me a bit of tumbleweed blowing past there, I think.
Very Python-esque joke there at the beginning. There.
It is. I'm not going into my
Python sketch.
Not doing stand-up. I think we'll stick to the podcast. But Dominic, I mean, it's true, isn't it? There's so many different groups out there in all kinds of walks of life. I mean, how did groups get started in the first place? I mean, who invented them? Where did they come from? What do they do?
Well, I suppose maybe you could go back a step, and actually your joke is a pretty good example. In a way, if you think about who you're most likely to have an argument with, it's probably someone in your family or a friend, someone you see a lot of, but some very tiny difference becomes really important, and that creates a division. And I suppose we're used to thinking about what divides and unites us in all sorts of ways that sort of matter to us. Like, what do we want to achieve? Whether it's, I don't know, a band doing a piece of music, or whether it's a theatre troupe doing a play, or whether it's some academics working together. What do you want to achieve, and who's getting in your way, and who's on your side? So what's going to make it easier and less easy? And so we're very used to trying to detect that and classify who's with us and who's against us, because that really matters for whether you can do the next thing you want to do. And sometimes we have a pretty long-term perspective on that, but most of the time it's relatively short-term. And that's why, three kids sitting around the table can start arguing about the cornflakes. I want them. No. I want these, though you want those. So, conflict all the time, difference. You're looking for that. Who's going to be in my way? Who's going to help me? So it's kind of natural product, I think, of that. It's not quite a survival instinct, but it's the ability to adapt to the situation and recognise what you need to do to move forward.
I mean, how much of that is our innate nature, if you like, because obviously a big argument about nature and nurture. But I mean, in truth, we haven't really evolved. We evolve incredibly slowly. I mean, iPads evolve faster than we do. So how far back can we go and say has there actually been a change in this behavior since people were running around in caves?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I suppose, if you go right back, it sort of goes back to what you need to function as a human being, because even is it safe to sit on this rock, or should I sit on that rock? Should I eat this lizard or that lizard? I mean, all those things are binary decisions you have to make. Is it in or is it out all the time? And so, that's just a cognitive need, right? It's not really about a social thing. But then you begin to apply that to all of your social relationships as well. The same sort of thing has to be, you have to make these judgments all the time and understand what you're doing. So I think we've always had that innate tendency to want to classify things. And then what's different, though, is I think we can recognize it. We understand a lot about it. And, it's interesting when you're looking at the Euros and people debating. I think there was a German ex-football manager on the panel with an English group of pundits talking about the England-Germany match. And, the Germany manager was saying, well, of course I support Germany here, but I really still feel positive for England, even though it's won. And it's kind of like, it's the ability to recognise that we have those biases that enables us to get past them and also take the longer picture and say, well, it's not all about winning the game. It's about being a strong team and surviving the tournament and all the rest. So I think we've got, there's a lot innate in us that gives us the capacity to use these skills of categorizing things, but there's also a lot in us that enables us to get past them.
So I want to pick a little thing. So it's very interesting that, for example, the racial abuse that got hurled at English players for missing a penalty, which was ridiculous, but it existed. A similar thing happened in France when Mbappe, who was their best player and is 22 years old and was a legend up till the moment when he missed the penalty, at which point racial abuse. Lewis Hamilton takes out a Dutchman. Now, I don't know if that was English people heaping racial abuse on Lewis Hamilton. I suspect it was a lot of Dutch people who were Max Verstappen fans, right? So where is the tipping point where that tribalism can descend into irrationality? Because what you're saying is that tribalism actually, or group association, has got some really good things about it, and it enables us to work together, enables us to do bigger things than we could individually, all those stuff. But what's the tipping point that makes an individual unable to control his tribal urges?
Yeah.
What is it? Is it chemicals? What is it?
I don't think it's chemicals at all. No, I mean, I think it's the strength of their sort of identity as a member of a group. So, I mean, if you're an England fan, it doesn't really matter who's missed the penalty in a way, but you don't want to blame the whole team for the defeat, because that's like blaming yourself. Because if you're completely identified with the team, like that is really part of who you are as a person, then that failure, it feels really painful. And so one of the natural reactions to that is to try and sort of hive off, well, who are the bad people in the team who we can blame for that failure? They don't represent the rest of the team. They're just the bad ones. I think it was very unfortunate that our three black players took those penalties in that sequence that they did. That just kind of made very salient that there were a set of people, they all happened to be black. The racists out there immediately jumped on that. But what they were doing, as much as hurling abuse, racist abuse, was also protecting their own identity as England fans.
That's the bit that I'm getting to is why couldn't people look at it in the totality and go, look, it's a team. You live as a team, you lose as a team. That's it. I mean, which is to be, I think Southgate was really good at that, because he took it on the chin and took the entire defeat of the team and said, "That's my fault.
Yeah.
You know, and in actual fact, in terms of the penalties, it probably was.
Yeah. Well, also,
But,
I mean, it's different for because I mean, we look at members of groups and we look at them differently depending on how long they've been in that group and how much they've put into it. So if they're relatively new members, like very young team players, or maybe a new person joins the band, and they make a couple of mistakes, you tend to be even more hypercritical of them because it really matters that they absolutely sort of match the team or group standards. Someone who's been there a while, well, they can make one or two mistakes, doesn't matter too much. Someone who's maybe about to leave, you'll even forgive all of that, and you don't expect them even to play well. You might just have them stand up there and
it's pretty Stone Age, pretty Stone Age stuff, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, it really is throwing rocks at each other.
Well, I was just about to come back to that actually, because I mean, I suppose, Dominic, thinking about it, if you look at going back to Bruce's earlier question about where groups started, I mean, I guess it would have started way back with our ancient ancestors, wasn't it? And living in groups in a very uncertain environment in prehistoric times, there was literally safety in numbers, wasn't there? I mean, obviously, if you lived together as a small group, you would be less likely to be attacked by predators. You had, to a certain extent, division of labour. So I guess I've always seen it as groups. If we go right back into our ancient ancestors, into evolutionary history, we're kind of our very first insurance premium, I guess. And they kept us alive. And I guess that these days our brains haven't changed that much actually to the brains of some of our brains anyway, brains of those who lived many hundreds of thousands of years ago. So this kind of group instinct, this kind of safety in numbers things is still in there, isn't it?
It is, but I mean, you've also got to think we live in multiple groups, right? So most of us, we might support a football team, like a music band, still think back fondly to the school we went to or not, all sorts of stuff. Lots of groups, some, men, women, all the rest. So those are all layered. And then you've also got hierarchies of groups. So let's say we all think of ourselves as British, but some of us also think of ourselves as English or Scottish or Welsh or from Yorkshire. So you've got all of that going on. So where the issues come out, and it's quite interesting, when do people do really bad things because of their group memberships? Well, actually, it turns out that we tend to forgive people who cheat on our own behalf. I mean, probably the Euros was a great example. There's plenty of cheating going on, but we're quick to call out the opposing team when they do it, and we kind of when we do it, it's maybe not so bad. So it's not like there's a moral high ground of groups or anything. I mean, groups, when they're in competition, they will do lots of ruthless things to get ahead of each other. Usually, if they call each other out, it's because of some higher order group they refer to. That's why we have the law. That's what you refer to when you actually want to criticize someone. Say, oh, well, they broke the law. But actually, the way groups work is to protect themselves most of the time. And you can see that right to the top levels of government.
What this makes me want to ask is, I mean, Dom, if you were, are groups on balance, are they actually good for us? I mean, they exist, but are they actually good for us? If you were like the head of the research and development unit of natural selection, evolution in hindsight, would you put a health warning on the side of groups saying groups can seriously damage your health? I mean, are they actually on balance good for us or not?
No, they're everything for us. I mean, they're like cars or anything else. Like, they're a part of our infrastructure. You can't live without them. Absolutely can't live without them. But they can be incredibly destructive as well. So the real skill is to manage those groups, manage those group memberships and the relationships between them in a way that produces positive things rather than negative things. I mean, it is absolutely the case, of course, that all the conflicts and wars, whether it's based on religion or territory or natural resources or anything else, they are group interests, and they're groups fighting with each other and causing massive destruction and misery. But on the other hand, so are all the positive things. So the global fight against climate change is going to have to be a collective fight. You cannot do it on your own as individuals. And so that requires groups to work together to make it happen. Mm-hmm. So I think
that's already turning into a political competition, though.
Yeah.
The same as the vaccine. Same as vaccine status is already turning into a political competition. It's been tossed around and used and abused by the different vaccine providers and what have you. It's interesting what's going on there. I mean, I don't think there's any way around it. One group will be the top dog group, or will aspire to it. I mean, is there a thing as well that groups have sort of gotten out of control because the social fabric that once controlled those groups has broken down, largely because we've lost control of the flow of it. The governments, certain people, the top groups have lost control of the flow of information that goes to the members of their normal groups, like the class system, for example. Gave you can argue that it produced some some very bad effects, particularly for certain groups in society, but it did preserve a structure, and that structure has now crumbled to a large extent and been replaced by uncertainty.
Yeah, no, well, I agree. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
no, don't say that.
Well, exactly.
Don't say you agree.
Well, I agree because I think what's happened. I mean, actually, we've got growing inequality, and part of the reason for that is that the unions have effectively disappeared as forces in society. I mean, they're still really important, but in terms of where they were in 20 years ago or 40 years ago, they really don't have the influence or the power, and they're not the main way in which people organise their lives and their orientation to government and the state and all the rest. So I think poorer people have found themselves very disconnected from any routes to have influence. But what happens, I think that eventually the void is filled and people self-organise into groups, and the risk is that those groups have their own sets of rules, their own sets of goals, their own sets of morals, if you like, that they apply.
That's what I was trying to get to here.
Yeah.
It's the instability that can create really perverse outcomes.
Yeah, at the top end as well as the bottom end. I mean, the very rich are doing the same thing. They have their own rules for where they put their money, how they spend it, what's important to spend it on, how much they pay in tax, all the rest. I mean, they effectively set their own rules as a sort of global cartel in various ways, and governments are losing control over that because the traditional systems of regulations are falling away. But I think we will have to come up with different things. There's no question about it. But yeah, I mean, groups will self-organise if no one else does. I mean, that's why the Mafia has been so successful for so long, is that basically it filled a gap by creating a social system that people had to live within. They knew what the rules were, they knew how they had to behave, they knew who not to cross and all the rest. And government became kind of a bit irrelevant, really, in that context, in many parts of Italy, for example. So, groups will do that. But we need that, because if we don't have those rules, even if they're unwritten rules, we don't know how to behave or what to do or what decisions to make.
I mean, that's quite depressing, actually. The Mafia is possibly a good thing.
I'd say it's a necessary thing. Those groups something will always fill the gap. If you haven't got norms, if you haven't got rules, people don't understand, they're very uncertain about what to do. They will seek membership of or affiliation with a group that gives them a clear way forward. So I think that's the crucial thing. And if a responsible government will provide a structure that gives you that certainty and confidence and clarity, so that you understand what needs to be done, what's expected of you and others. And clearly in the West, things are shifting quite fast.
Do you know? I'm kind of reminded on that note, Dom, of I think it was the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes that said that actually we're basically brutish and animalistic by nature, and it's the rule of law that keeps us in line. And there was a French philosopher called Michel Maffesoli, who also said that if the structure of society or culture starts to break down, then we will start looking to the organisational principles of the distant past to kind of get us through. And when you're talking there, I'm thinking about, well, this is almost like the recipe for what's happening on social media and the internet. Where the kind of the legal structure, the kind of the moral kind of thing is not as easy to enforce on there, and of course it doesn't have the same structure. The internet doesn't have the same structure as society, and so do you think actually this is also like where we're becoming more tribal in a sense because of the fact that actually the moral structure on social media and the internet isn't there? And also, there is this tendency to regress to the organisational principles of distant past, and we do kind of get into these like tribes? I mean, do you think that's a fair point? Is social media exacerbating tribalism or not?
Not exactly. I think. I mean, there's an element of that, but I look at it the other way, which is that you could be a member of 25 different Facebook groups easily, right? And they all have different things they want to do in different ways they want to do it. And you, a skilled social operator like you and many others, will know what you do in each of those different Facebook groups, and it's not the same thing in all of them. And so, I mean, pure tribalism means you really only have one tribe, and that's it. There's nothing else. And we aren't like that. We're capable of being members of multiple tribes. We're capable of switching our behaviours, changing our moral stances and priorities, all kinds of things. We're very, very flexible. So although the notion of tribalism is very appealing, it doesn't quite cover what's going on. What the internet and social media generally has opened up now is much greater fluidity in the way that people can connect with each other. And that, on the one hand, means that people might be less likely to get locked into something really bad, like a cult or something like that. On the other hand, it means you can't depend on people so much to stay in the tribe, because they're not in one tribe, they're in multiple tribes. So that makes it more complicated, more fluid, but also more flexible, and gives us a much better chance to adapt. So something like climate change, which does require global cooperation, really means you have to have a global consensus amongst people that change is necessary and that we're all going to have to adapt. And you can build that now in a way that you couldn't do before, because before it was all done through national intermediaries, your foreign minister or something like that talking to some other foreign ministers. Well, now the people can actually talk to each other as well, so it's very different, I think.
So we're hoping you are enjoying our little chat on Schizo Espresso, but don't forget, we do have a special thing for you. If you want to pay £4 a month, you can become a Patreon, which means you get the unedited content, you get the extra long episodes, and we're even going to come up with some special stuff for you. You can become a Patreon if you want at www.patreon.com/psycho-schizo espresso. And now, back to the music.
Is there also a sort of a cognitive basis to us and them as well, that just as like our brains divide, if you look at the electromagnetic color spectrum, for instance, who can tell where red goes into orange, where orange goes into yellow, etc., etc. And yet we perceive the 7 primary colors of a rainbow. So, we categorize, naturally our brains are kind of programmed to categorize between all kinds of different things to make sense of the world. Okay, so there's that evolutionary argument to groups, the very first insurance premiums and what have you, safety in numbers. But is there also a cognitive basis to them that actually, just as we categorize everything else and we see lines between everything else, like physical phenomena, also, we're just as likely to draw lines between social phenomena, different groups of people. Yeah,
absolutely. There is. I mean, the first thing you do is you figure out, are these other people in my category or not, whatever it is. we have male and female toilets in most places still, and that's an immediate categorization. It tells you if you think you're male, you're going to go into the male one, not the female one, and vice versa. So, those sorts of things that have always been with us. You have the different queuing lanes when you get to an airport for where you've come from. Everything depends on categorization. You've got traffic lights all over the place. That's all categorization. So we're used to categorizing things. The minute we categorize things, we make things in the same category much more similar cognitively than they really are. And we make differences between those categories bigger than they really are. And when we are in one of those categories ourselves, we then apply value to it. We start, that's an important category, and now I want to invest that with something that matters. I want to feel good about it. I want that thing which is part of me now to be a good thing, to be a better thing than alternatives.
That's very interesting, because I mean, at the moment, the group I'm thinking of, when the groups you said, okay, men and women, which of two obviously pretty fundamental groups in evolution and in society. And now, of course, there's a third group, which is people who identify as a bit of one or the other, or a mixture of both, or any way you want. Yeah. But it comes down to some very practical things. And what's interesting is the fact that women who have fought long and hard to be valued as equally and not discriminated against by groups of usually men in society, are now basically discriminating against often a third group, which are people who are transgender people. So, for example, in a gym in France recently, all the women got together and said, we're not having any transgender people in our showers in the gym because they've got a willy. So, I mean, obviously they haven't had the full op, but nevertheless they're identifying as a woman. They've got breasts and all the rest of it, and they just happen to have an appendage, So no, absolutely not. They're not allowed in our changing rooms, And it's an interesting one. What would happen if in a bloke's changing room, if you had a transgender female to male go in there, and the bloke's wandering around with hairy chest and everything else, but quite clearly doesn't have the appendage. It's interesting. I mean, and I said, well, actually, from a bloke's perspective, it sounds rather crass, but I can't see what the beef is. But I genuinely don't understand. I mean, why would women be that intolerant? Because obviously, if you're a bloke and you're in the showers and a bloke walks in and he's got a female genitalia as well as, but looks like a bloke, you think, oh, no big deal with that,
No, I mean, I think it goes back to the power relationship between men and women, doesn't it? And
yes, it does.
If you're a woman, there's it still psychologically feels like that's a threat in your presence. If you're a man, it doesn't really feel like a threat at all. It's something a bit different. It doesn't matter. So I think
but it goes back. It goes back. How far back does that go? How primitive is that? And is that a primitive thing that's ingrained in our brains, or what?
Well, it's really impossible to say that because we've been so strongly socialized into thinking male female about so many things. It's really hard to know whether that's just socialization or whether it's really is so ingrained that you can't get out of it. I mean, I think like all categories, you can apply them more or less strongly. And race is probably a good one. I mean, it used to be in Britain that there were pretty much two racial categories. There were white people, and then there were people who were brought in, the sort of Windrush generation, all that.
Yeah.
And so it was black or white, basically. But, within a very short space of time, in evolutionary terms, we're now in a much more multi-ethnic, multiracial society. So you can't really use a term other than something like non-white, which doesn't really mean anything very much. You can't really use BAME, because that is too inclusive of too many different groups of people. So actually, it all becomes much harder to apply a simple categorization to race. And that's a good thing. And that means we have to start dissolving the use of that, what you might have thought was an absolutely automatic categorization you would always use, 20, 30 years ago, dead simple, black or white. Now it's not so simple. So it's not relevant in many cases. So, we're seeing past race much more easily than we used to. It's still a massive issue, of course, but not of the same order that it was in terms of our sort of cognitive approach to it. We're used to the idea that people could be mixed race, they could be from all over the world, all kinds of different things. We can't make assumptions about their cultural background on the basis of their skin color. So, all that's changing. And I suppose arguably in the workplace, we've tried to make gender seem a much less relevant factor. Try to make promotion procedures so that they don't bias in terms of gender. We're making some progress on those fronts. So, we can actually work past these categories and actually, going back to what I was saying earlier about us being now connected to many more different types of groups all over the place, it's more likely that we'll have that flexibility to see people from multiple perspectives and not just pigeonhole them as part of a single category. That said, once you're in competition with another group, they're the out group, you're the in group, there's going to be all those, as it were, tribal factors coming back into play.
Dom, on that, that begs a really interesting question there. And that is, do you think that for any given, I don't know, subject or area, whatever, gender, race or something, do you think that there exists, let's take gender, for example. I mean, Facebook, I think, have got something like 70 different categories of gender on their drop-down menu, something like that. I mean, do you think there can be too many groups? Do you think that for any particular kind of concept out there in the ether somewhere, there might exist like an optimal number of categories or groups. So just like, when we look at the electromagnetic color spectrum, our brains, and there are cultural differences, of course, here, but Western culture, our brains tend to pick out 7 primary colors, these are the 7 colors, because they're functional. We don't see all the millions of different hues because we don't need them. So if you look at, say, something like Facebook, 70 different categories for gender, I mean, do you think that there's an argument to say that actually, sometimes too many groups can get in the way of actually, facilitating social cohesion? I mean, if you were to divide gender up, we go back and using the evolutionary argument, if you were to go back and divide gender up, say gender's a plot of land, is it right? Does it make sense that we should divide it up into 70 different subplots, or is that just, is it just confusing matters?
People don't like to be part of a group that is they like either to be part of a group that is like massively powerful, like American, for example, or they like to be part of a group that is what you call optimally distinctive, which means that if there's lots of groups around, you don't want to be one of the mini fish swimming around, and you don't want to be a whale. You want to be somewhere, you want to be a dolphin or something, or a shark, something quite big, quite distinctive, quite easy to spot, makes its mark. You don't own the whole system, but you're not a minnow either. So, I mean, that's where people tend to feel most comfortable. And so you see often, I mean, when you talk about factions in the Labour Party, or for that matter in the Conservative Party, these are actually where the group is too big to contain the diversity of opinion or interest or whatever within it. And then it's going to split and subdivide. But on the other hand, you don't want to be the breakaway coalition that ends up with only 2 members and has to give up and disappear. Yeah. So... Yeah,
George Galloway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you've got this, and that goes on the whole time. And actually, one of the interesting things about musical groups is it always fascinates me, the sort of that transition from being in a band with maybe, I don't know, somewhere between sort of 4 and maybe 8 people or something like that, which is quite a sort of manageable size, to when it starts becoming a bit orchestral, and then it's something else. Then it's an organisation, not a group. And it becomes hierarchical instead of horizontal. And that changes its nature altogether.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. A few years ago, I had a joke. There's a fellow walking down the streets of Belfast in the middle of the night, and he feels a gun pressed against his head, and a voice whispers in his ear, "Are you Catholic or Protestant?" And he thinks really quickly, and he says, "I'm Jewish." And the voice comes back, "Then I must be the luckiest Arab in Belfast." If you have groups, we've talked about groups being inevitable in evolutionary history, because we basically they function, they get us through everything we want to do, form all kinds of functions. So if groups are inevitable, is tension between them inevitable? As soon as you have groups, as soon as you invent groups, is there always inevitably going to be trouble between them?
Pretty much. Because otherwise, why wouldn't they just become one group?
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a Spitfire going past me for some reason at the moment outside the window. You hear a noise.
Good stuff. There you go. It's
you
funny.
Used to fly one of those, didn't you, Bruce?
Yeah, no, I had 20 minutes to the back of one. But I once, when I was working as a pilot, I had to fly Glasgow Rangers to Tel Aviv to play Hapoel Tel Aviv in some cup, whatever it was, match, right? So, I was just a pilot, but we got tickets to the match, right? And it was a little bit chilly in Tel Aviv in the winter, in the evenings and stuff like that. So we all got tickets to the match. So we go and plonk ourselves in the seats. Now, the only little woolly hat that I had happened to be the colour blue, which is Glasgow Rangers colours. And all the Hapoel lads and lasses were all wearing Hapoel hats, which were red. So in a sea of red, I plonked myself down with a little blue hat on and become acutely aware that everybody's staring at me. And I'm sort of sat there watching the match, and finally some guy turns around and goes, points to my hat. I said, "What's with the hat?" I said, "Oh, it's just a blue hat. I didn't have anything else." And he just looked at me. And he was completely stumped.
Yeah.
He had no idea what to say because I didn't respond with like, piss off, fuck off, it's my blue hat. I was just like, no, it's just a hat, mate.
Yeah.
What? What do you mean it's just a hat? Yeah, it's just a hat.
How can it be? Yeah.
So it's good. You just and I was English and not Scottish, but I mean I don't know if you knew about could detect any accent or whatever. And he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "No, I just came to watch the match." He said, "To be honest with you, I'm not really bothered about football. I just came to watch the match."
Yeah.
And that even stumped him even more. Not only was I not part of a rival group, I wasn't part of any group. How can you not be part of any group?
A high need for uniqueness, Bruce. That's what it is. There's a need for uniqueness, and it's a high need for. There's a spectrum, right? Some of us really want to conform. Some of us really want to stand out. And sounds like he would have thought you had a very high need for uniqueness there.
Yeah, well, I do, I guess.
On the red hat, blue hat spectrum. But it's, Dominic, I mean, I suppose the $1 million question is, and I know you do a lot of work on this, I mean, if tension between groups is inevitable, then what can we do about it? I mean, I always remember when I was in your classes, there was this fantastic experiment which highlights it. It was called the minimal group paradigm. Which was an experiment which was conducted back in 1970, over 50 years ago, by a social psychologist called Henri Tagefel. And Tagefel got a group of schoolboys, and he basically showed them a load of dots on a computer screen, and they had to estimate very quickly how many dots there were. And there were so many of them, and it was presented for such a rapid a short space of time. They had no real idea how accurate they were being. And this little device enabled Tagefel to fiendishly divide the lads into two arbitrary groups, right? So one was underestimators and one was overestimators. And it was just particularly, just arbitrary. It was just, he could have divided them up on any axis, but he divided them up on the basis of this particular task. And he then let the groups kind of just, talk to each other and get on with each other. And so you had two separate groups now. You had underestimators and overestimators. And then later on in the experiment, he asked them, it was a series of tasks they had to perform, but one of them was he asked each group to allocate points, which they thought equated later to prizes, financial reward, to members of the cohort. And what he discovered was that members of the underestimators awarded those points almost across the board to members of their own group, and the same happened with the overestimators. And when they were asked to nominate who their best friends were, even though they were, they knew each other from the same class, same school, they would tend to nominate members of their own in-group. And this became known in social psychology as the minimal group paradigm, because it's very, very easy, Tagefel demonstrated on the basis of the experiment, to create in-group bias and to split people up into these kinds of different groups. You can do it very, very easily. And create tension very, very easily. So I guess the $1 million question, Dom, is if it's so easy, if as soon as you get groups, we gel together and in groups and kind of denigrate out groups, then what hope is there for us? Is there a way around it? If we can't get rid of the tension, is there a way that we can somehow, I don't know, dampen it down or circumvent it to some extent?
Well, that's what sports leagues are about, really, is that you have these multiple competitions between different teams. And so but you need the league to survive as well. In other words, you need most of the teams to do pretty well in order for the whole system to survive. And that's kind of the way groups are. And actually, if you even go back to those old minimal group experiments, what you saw was a number of different strategies that the kids would employ. So one was if they thought they could maximize the amount of reward for everybody, if that was an option on the table, they would tend to do that. So if you say, you can have 50 quid, they can have 40 quid, that's fine, or the other way around, that's fine, as compared with, maybe you get less and they get even less. But on top of that, that said, then they will also say, well, given if it's a choice between, let's say, overall we're a bit ahead and we can make ourselves a bit more ahead, even if that doesn't give us as much as we could get in total, but it keeps them behind us, that's what we'll do. So it's more about the motivation to keep your own group ahead than it is to necessarily do the other group down. So I don't think you need to assume that competitive tendency, that instinct, if you like, the urge, is one that is necessarily one of sort of hatred or aggression against out groups. It can be, It can turn into that. But I think at its starting point, it's more about providing that sort of positive sense of distinctiveness and value for your own group. So you don't really care about what happens to the other group. It's more about making your own group seem valid. Now, what happens then? If you've got two groups going at that, right? They're both doing it, and they're both then claiming, well, we're the ones who are the best, the right, the superior. That could be a religious ideology, or it could be football, or it could be anything. Then you start getting the conflict, because then it goes, our way of doing things is better than your way of doing things. Well, we're going to defend our way of doing things, and you should stop doing things your way. Well, we're going to make it illegal for you to do it your way, and then you get conflict really sort of hitting hard. So what we have to do is have systems that enable the difference to exist, and not let it get to a position where one group starts to dominate and force the other into a conflict. And that's very difficult, because sometimes groups want to do bad things, and you need to stop them. So
yeah. Well, that's the trouble when you get nation states want to do bad things.
Yeah. Exactly.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
I think rule of law within a state, if you do it right, should be able to mitigate some of the worst effects, of it. So if you have a carrot and stick approach, then then celebrate the differences in the appropriate ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
if
it becomes,
and you can cross-cut these different conflicts as well, so that if you say through some of those experiments, for example, you put people into the A's and the B's, or the blues and the reds, or something else, and then you'd also say, actually, there's also boys and girls here. So now you've got a choice. You're going to favour you're a blue boy, or a red boy, or are you going to favour or a blue girl or a red girl? So then people then go, oh, okay, hang on, this is more complicated than I thought. I can't just go, it's blues versus reds. It's going the other way as well. So, and that can neutralise a lot of those things, and it forces people to rethink and not make that jump into direct conflict. Where the real risks happen is where you get groups sort of encapsulated and isolated, so people don't feel part of any other cross-cutting groups. And then the one in-group really does become like a tribe. It gains enormous power over them, changes the way they think and see things, what they think is important, what they think the norms are, and then you can get really dangerous behaviours.
Well, there was a great example of that, Dom. I'm sure you're aware of the study where they did something similar in Beirut with I think it was 18 school children or students over there, and they were a combination of Christian and Muslim. And they divided the groups, the minimal groups, into blue ghosts and red genies. And conflict soon broke out, not between the Christians and the Muslims, but between the blue ghosts and the red genies. So actually, it seems to be that, you're right. You can kind of socially engineer what groups are particularly salient, I guess. But also I was reminded of another study you used to talk about, which was, I think it was called the Robbers Cave study. Which was a very famous social psychology experiment. It was conducted back in the 50s. Long story short, there were two groups in a summer camp in America, and they gradually became aware of each other. And the more they became aware of each other, the more hostile they got to each other. And both groups, I think, deliberately asked, once they became aware of the other group, to engage in competition for the summer camp instructors to set up a competitive game or something where they could, basically compete against the other group. And it did get quite hostile, didn't it? Until the summer camp instructors engineered a way in which they could work together to solve a problem that was of mutual benefit to them. And it was that then kind of turned them round a little bit, wasn't it? So I'm thinking maybe, if you've got groups that are competitive, you're oppositional in a bad way, then maybe some kind of superordinate kind of goal might help bring them together.
The classic example of that is the Second World War in the UK, whereby everybody was in the same boat, everybody got rationed, everybody pulled together, made all the sacrifices, and then at the end of the war, they reverted back to their tribes.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because, in fact, we were doing some research funded by the Mafia Foundation on people's perception of unity and division across the UK throughout the pandemic. So we first started collecting data, I think, in sort of May 2020. At that point, we'd just sort of gone into the first lockdown. There was enormous sense of unity. In fact, for the first time in a long time, more people thought the United Kingdom was united than thought it was divided. And actually, if you go back a bit, and just after the 2019 general election, there was a huge perception that, you know, we were all at loggerheads. Brexit had caused factions everywhere. Yeah. Well, the thing is, that big bonus in sort of unity that came from that first lockdown has gradually evaporated, and we're now back down where we were in 2019. And that's perhaps the more interesting question. It's not how does that common adversity in a crisis bring us all together, but how do you keep us all together once that immediate adversity seems to have passed and things get more complicated. And that is the real challenge. And governments have not managed to grapple with that very well at all.
But it's the underlying tensions, and movements in society that the fissures will start to, you know, the fact you put a sticking plaster on it temporarily for whatever, and that works for a while, but the pressure cooker underneath is gonna force the fissure open again. I mean, it goes back to one of our other podcasts. You know, your question, Kevin, about, you know, would you kill the baby Jesus? Sorry, the baby Hitler.
Well, you'll kill it.
Okay,
somebody did.
Mind you, that's another question.
Kill the baby Jesus, I think, didn't they? But,
that's another question. That's another question. Sorry, would you kill the?
We'll leave that in. We'll leave that in.
They tried.
Yeah. Would you kill the baby? Would you kill the baby Hitler? And one of the justifications that a lot of people gave, myself included, for not doing it, was that something along those lines would probably have happened anyway, if not with Hitler, within one of the other members of his entourage or another demagogue would have, because the currents were historical currents were there to create that. It was already going down that road, you know. Yeah. So I mean, Hitler might have been the match, but there would have been another one came along, you know, and under those circumstances.
Do you think that? So, I mean, do you think that there would have been a different Trump if we hadn't had Trump? What would it have been like? Would we have had Sarah Palin or someone, or, you know, would it have been the same sort of thing but just in different hands?
Potentially, yes, because and unfortunately you can see the currents underpinning all you know what's going on in America. You can see it with Biden, because what he says and what he does, he ain't the same thing. You know, so much of what Biden is doing is merely a continuation of what Trump did. Yes, there are a few differences, but I don't believe the differences are nearly as material as the similarities. Yes, he's nuancing the message differently, but the reality on the ground is ain't so very different.
Do you know, I live in a small Cotswold town, and talking about would you kill the baby Jesus, Bruce? The one Christmas, you know, when churches put like little like nativity displays outside the church, one Christmas. A few years ago, the baby Jesus was stolen from the crib. And so we had this nativity display without the baby Jesus. And the next year, this is actually true, the next year, the church nailed baby Jesus down into the crib. And I thought to myself, what a start that poor kid had in life. Eh? I mean, he was. I mean, I'm sure they didn't see the irony of what was to later transpire in his life. Sure, but I mean, they actually nailed the baby Jesus down to the crib. Dominic, listen. One last thing for you. We were talking about, you know, what we can do, you know, to kind of mitigate group tension. I heard this fascinating fact a couple of weeks ago that if you put black ants and fire ants in a jar together, they get on perfectly well until you shake the jar. And then when you shake the jar, the black ants and the fire ants start fighting each other because they both blame each other for stress, the disruption and the shaking of the jar. And I'm just wondering whether there's a parallel here, you know, rounding things off for us, you know, that actually there's so much conflict. There's conflict between, you know, there's gender wars, there's conflict between black and white, there's conflict, religious problems all over the place. And maybe sometimes it might be worth just reflecting on who's shaking the jar rather than just fighting each other. Maybe we should think, well, hey, hang on a minute, you know, maybe we can all live together perfectly well, but actually there's another hand on this jar shaking it, and actually that's what we should be looking out for.
It's a question of stress.
Yeah.
So it's like social, or I mean, in that case, obviously, that's shaking the jar is a big environmental stress that would cause,
Well, what if nobody's shaking the jar? What if it's just shaking, right? Which is the real problem, that you can't point the finger. And in fact, pointing the finger, you're always going to only get part of the target. It's always more than one shaker going on. And that, I think, is the difficulty. So actually, I think it's more like, well, once you put the jar down again, do the ants go back to their two little clusters, or do they keep on murdering each other? And I think we have to accept that under a big time of stress, you will get factions, you will get people saying, why am I being denied resources or things that I need, or why is my life being turned upside down, and looking for people to blame and out-groups and all the rest. But you've got to say, if you can get past those bumps, can you get back to a situation where people actually will coexist happily together and work together for things that they all need? And that is where it needs some sensitive management. It needs people who are thinking about it and working with across different groups to get them to have shared agendas and aims and objectives. And then I think there is hope. I don't feel hopeless about any of this. I think that, as we said at the beginning, really, groups have tremendous strengths and capacities and can do things that individuals absolutely cannot. But also they hold the seeds of our own destruction if we're not careful. So we have to use groups, with enormous care and sensitivity.
Dominic, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thought that was fascinating. Don't know what you thought, Bruce. I just thought it was just absolutely brilliant. Hello folks, we hope you're enjoying Psycho Schizo Espresso. Just to remind you, it's a pod prod production, so please feel free to like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. You can also reach out to us on email at pse@podprod.co.uk and follow us on social media on the hashtag Psycho Schizo Espresso. You can also, of course, become a Patreon by clicking on www.patreon.com/Psycho Schizo Espresso, where you can gain exclusive access to unedited and unfiltered content if your brain can possibly handle any more of me and Bruce.